Hello, everyone. This is Tristan McGough, and once again, we are entertaining ourselves with Selfology 101. And today, in terms of the 7 ideas of the self that we were speaking about that naturally arise as pristine cognitions in all of our being, it's intuitively innate, as it were, these 7 ideas. We are going to be covering the aeon that is considering the self as the one. Now, last time we considered the self as the all, as omnos. If we take a look once again here at the 7 intuitional ideas of self, very quickly, we'll see that the all, which is the all-encompassing, that's all itself. That's everything the self could possibly be. But I want to call your attention very quickly down here toward the bottom of this particular diagram, this piece of conceptual art that renders philosophic ideas in a graphic form for a kind of arrangement that becomes more, if you will, geometrically accessible to one's spatial consciousness in regards to meaning. We have cognos, and that's the conscious. And that's eventually it becomes the all-discerning consciousness, and this is the pristine consciousness which we all have, the all-discerning. Now, I could have actually began with this entire Selfology 101 discussing the self as the consciousness or the mind or the conscious. That is cognos. Because modern psychology, of course, revolves around this very idea of there being a psyche, or at least some kind of mental instrumentation that organizes experience past just the physical causation and the biological organization of the body we inhabit. So psychology actually is a branch of cognology, and modern psychology, even in the depth psychology of Freud and post-Freud, is dealing with a more expansive view of the individual self, the psychos, as I call it, the cognos. We could have just as well called it the psychos. Remember terms. They are not important except for landmarking the meanings that we're using at the time in our theories of description and explanation. And it's important to be clear about what terms we're using, because I could refer to the self as the mind, for instance, as it is in the Kabbalion, where their first principle is the principle of mentality, and they're dealing with the idea there that everything is reducible to mind as the generator of ideas, and from ideas, the various other dimensions that we experience, including even the solid, what we call 3-dimensional space-time continuum of this, which of course includes entities and all the energies within this continuum. So I could have began there, and we would have considered then the self as the individual conscious being. And everyone would have said, well, I understand then what you're talking about of the self. It's what I have as a sense of ahamkara, that is my sense of self. And there's a lot that goes into a sense of self. And we'll deal with that in cognos. And the unpacking of what the sense of I actually is, the I-ness. However, what I wanted to call your attention to is I began with the idea of the all-encompassing, because if we look at, for instance, Georg Cantor's idea, set theory, and his idea of bracketing things, it's like I said, it's the hopper, the reservoir. Well, it's Cantor's brackets. Anything that you can throw into this membership class that is called omnos, the all, that is what goes in. And so therefore I have it at the center because it really expands and includes all of it. All right, wonderful. So last time we were considering that the all itself, that is the entirety. This time we're looking at the singularity. We're looking at the only itself. So from looking at it as gigantic infinite arms that stretch into limitless time, endless space, inexhaustible energy, as well as numberless entities. If you had all of that, now what's the reverse of that? The reverse of that is collapsed into an ontological instant, a one. This is where we are considering here the all equalizing, because it doesn't matter whether you look at your individual self or my individual self as a cognos. It doesn't matter whether you look at, in terms of reality, that I have a finite aspect of body that you can see, words that clearly are syllabicizing sound, dividing it up into meaningful semantic units that are syntactically correct, and you can understand this because you as well were taught the fundamentals of English grammar. Someone else in another language is understanding things from their finite point of view, but remember, in terms of reality, which we will be considering next week, the real will delve into the four ontological primitives, the quadrants of being. We'll touch on that in a moment again. However, in terms of today, what we are looking at is it doesn't matter what finite thing you take, or transfinite thing, or infinite, boundless category, whether it's time, or space, or energy, or infinite entities. They're all part of one. They all have their source in one. They are all in the image of one, which, remember, as we were talking about the tricosm, is the macrocosm. Then I'm an example of a microcosm. But I'm constituted of, if we could, countable, though infinitesimally small, particulates, or minicosms, whether you take it as the cell, or the molecules of the cell, or the atoms, or the subatomic particles, or a quark, or whatever. Every one of those can be considered from the angle of being one, an aeon. And so that's what we're going to consider today. I began with the big picture. I didn't begin with our reference of self as a self-reference. I looked and I said, what do we first have as a naturally arising, pristine cognition? An intuitive idea of what it means to be a self. Well, the first thing is it's all and everything. That's the one and only, the sole and single. Whether it's being, in its two aspects of infinite being or finite being, or whether it's non-being, or whether it's conscious being. You need all four elements in your ingredients of reality in order to make sense, if you will, of the world we are living in and that you, in particular, are experiencing. So we'll get to all of these in their turn. Today, we're dealing with the all-equalizing one. Let's take and review three quotes that help guide us into this field of the self as one rather than the self as all. Of course, we'll begin with Sri Yukteswar, who in his holy science says, Parabrahman, that is, the ground of being, the ground of everything, is infinite, complete, without start or end. It is one undividable being. Heraclitus, who's also the one who said one cannot step into the same river twice, in other words, being a philosopher of metamorphics or of change, Heraclitus also called attention to the unitive aspect of all this mutability, divisibility, discernibility, intelligibility, sensibility. All these things that are tangible and intangible, whether they're particulars or whether they're transfinite streams that we carry the particulars along as if we are an energetic consciousness stream, a Chittasantana that flows through time seamlessly in the eternal now, like a snake, Ouroboros, devouring its own tail. Not on my authority, but that on truth, it is wise for you to accept the fact that all things are one. So says Heraclitus. He's calling attention to the fact that it doesn't matter, as I was saying, whether you take something that's infinite, transfinite, or finite, that thing is part and parcel of its source, its ground. That's the one Heraclitus is calling our attention to. Now, D.T. Suzuki, the Zen master, who did so much to familiarize us in the West with the various types of Zen Buddhism, he says the one will, whole and complete, reminiscent, of course, of Sri Yukteswar, from an altogether different tradition, the one will, whole and complete in itself, is now at once actor and observer. Not only did I act, I observed that I acted. There we have a demonstration of existentiality. So these three individuals are calling our attention to the idea that whatever is the one is whole and complete. Well, that's exactly what we were saying about the entirety of the all, of Omnos. So here, when we encounter aeon, when we encounter what it is to be that singularity, that point, we find that three different individuals from three different time periods are calling our attention to the fact that whatever is going on out here in the finite world of particulars has a basis, a unition, a unitive base, a ground that establishes their ability to manifest. It's all about manifestation. It's all about measurement. It's all, whether it's in time, space, entity, energy, we are always measuring things, and that needs an apparatus or a methodology. How do you get from a point which has no dimensions to a line which suddenly has one dimension, right, direction, and then a plane, which like a triangle, right, it has two dimensions, and then you add another point, or two or three, or however many you want, and you have three dimensions. However, dimensionality is not confined just to space, right? Because we have two dimensions of time, before and after. Oh, we also have three dimensions of time. Past, future, present. Three dimensions of time. We also have, in terms of energy, two dimensions. Cause and effect. And we also have three dimensions. We have the cause, we have the effect, but we have the crucis, which is the point at which one is converted into the other. Just like the present converts the past into the future, or shall we say the future into the past. They're both merged because you have a retention and a protension as well as a intention in the present. These are part of your intentionalities. There are five of those. But then when it comes to entity, of course, we have two dimensions with those. There's self and other, right? But then there's self, there's me, and then there's you, and then there's them. Or there's me, and there's us, and there's it, all these things out there. There are 3 dimensions as well in terms of entity. Because in terms of the omniverse, you're not just looking at space and time continuum, you're looking at a space-time entity energy continuum. All 4 of those are bound up in creating what we call the continuum of manifestation. But that's manifestation. But they're part of the larger plenum, of which there is a ground, which is infinite and boundless, and then there's a nature, where things have particular existential, empirical, dimensional realities that can be measured. So we're going to be dealing with that today. And the aeon, as we've spoken of before, is actually the one and all. It is the alone, or it's the all one. It's all by itself, or it's everything as a unit, all taken as one. So it's the one and all. That is the aeon. And that consists of pure being, which is the apeiron. And that's unbounded being. That's unlimited being. That has the potential to go on infinitely, so that you could have an infinite amount of numbers. You could have an infinite amount of entities. You can have an infinite amount of colors, an infinite amount of sounds. But that potentiality is here in the unbounded being, and when you strike a note, it becomes aletheia, the bounded being. When you paint a pigment onto a canvas of a particular color, that's part of bounded being, that's a particular color, as well as the minerals that are holding the pigments together, etc. These are all part of bounded being, and you can look at bounded being from very many ways, and that's what science does. Science divides and divides and divides and divides, so that eventually, from ontology, you have all the various levels that filter down to the specifics of microbiology and molecular physics and subatomic particle, quantum mechanics. You can divide, and Husserl shows this very well when he's discussing about how sciences come into being. And they actually are ways that we are dividing up phenomena. And so as I'm dividing phenomena here into these 5 categories, I'm saying the aeon includes as the one and all unbounded being as well as bounded being, includes, in other words, the infinite as well as the finite. But more than that, I'm saying, how do you get something which is unbounded into a state of being bound? How do you get that which is potentially infinite, crystallized, manifested into a state-bound experience, whether it's 3 dimensions or more? Well, clearly, what's happening is you're not taking all the potential of being and putting it all into existence all at once. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a metallic pointer. There's been a lot carved away in order to get this pointer. This pointer is not this crystal sphere. It is not the pages. It is not your body. It is not my body. It's not my words. It's not any color I choose to imagine. That's not my history. This is something quite different. It's carved out of being to become finite being. And the only thing that is not being allowed to show itself is non-being. It is not this. In order for this to be a pointer, it has to not be everything else in the universe. That's a lot of knots. But in order to bring this pointer into existence, it didn't just happen through physical laws. There were also psychical laws. There were laws, for instance, that relate to the immanent activity of causation that happens intrapsychically. Remember, an immanent activity is where the cause stays with the one who is bringing about its effect. And the effect stays with the one that caused it. So if I have a thought of sadness, it stays with me. If I generate a thought of 2 plus 2 being 4, and that 4 added to 10 is 14, those are all logia. These are all ideas, are thoughts that I'm having at the moment. They're particular thoughts. They're finite. But at the same time, they're transfinite because I am the thread upon which all of those psychical experiences are connected. It's not connected to this. It's not connected to you. My mental effects are caused by me. They stay with me. That's immanent causation, or as I've termed it elsewhere, this is epistic causation. This is intrapsychic activity that remains. Otherwise, why would a therapist be sitting down with somebody on a couch in order to deal with their particular problems that are threaded transfinitely upon their thread of being? They could deal with anybody and just pull the same thoughts out. Well, of course they can't. Now, finite causation, physical causation, we're familiar with that, and that's what science studies. Psychology attempts to study the immanent type of causation that I'm here referring to as epistic or psychical causation, which is altogether different. You cannot say that the billiard ball of one idea, right? The white ball of my conscious attention hits another billiard ball as an idea. It's not that kind of causation. It's based on relation. And relation is something altogether different than the dimensionalized existence by which we organize ourselves in a world of diversity. Relation underpins that. Relation is always ever present. I'm always ever present as subject and object. I have this epistic relation that is object and subject. I can't have an object, a phenomena appear to me unless I'm there for it to appear to. That's your immanent activity causation, psychical or epistic causation. Now out here, it's transitive. It's empirical. I'm the cause of lifting this particular pointer or extending it or collapsing it. Transitive causation. I'm able, as a cause, to effect something which is extra-entitative. It's beyond me as just the single entity here as a body, or if you will, as a body-mind that's controlling this body, which is a more complete picture, right? We'll deal with that under cognology. However, the important point is here, there are two types of causality going on. And it's important to understand that there is a difference. And that's what creates these spheres. That's the difference between your psyche and your physique. The difference between your mind and your body is that there are two types of interdependent causation going on, a psychical and a physical. You have an individual karma that's going on, or causality, internal to yourself. That immanent causality is what the therapist treats. It's what you utilize in order to transform your feelings, your actions, your thoughts, and your deliberate volitions, your decisions, your intentions, your volitions. So now, what we are forced to admit is that not only do we have to include non-being in our picture of reality as one of its ingredients, because literally it's that which has carved away the infinity of potentiality so that it can become a finite actuality. And so that this can become a pointer and not an infinite pointer, we've been forced to admit that there is something carved away called non-being, and that I'm calling abhava, from the Hindu term. That's non-being. And again, from Sanskrit terminology, atma. Incidentally, aletheia and apeiron are Western terms, Greek terms. You'll see that I'm balancing out east and west here. So, atma is conscious being. We are forced to admit that not only is there infinite being that gets carved by non-being into finite being, but there's a carver. There's someone behind everything doing the carving. Try as you will to explain my present performance in explaining to you Selfology 101 in this third seminar on the aeon. Try explaining that in terms of physical causation alone. It cannot be done. You're on a fool's quest. There is a higher type of causation other than the transitive that occurs in the empirical world and the relational or the immanent that is forever part of the structure of your psychical world. There is a noumenal world, a spiritual world, a world of pure consciousness, and that is the ground, the root, the source of the relation that you bear, and of the multitude of manifestations that that relation bears in this outer world as actions and feelings and thoughts and intentions. And all the interactions you have in your ecologue, whether it's with your pet, with your spouse, with your parent, with a coworker, with the sky, with the plants around you, you are constantly engaged in an ecologue. That is a finite exchange of information between you and everything else, just on this physical plane, on this tangible plane that you can see. Not to mention all the other aspects that you're going to allow, of course, in the electromagnetic spectrum beyond the small visible spectrum that we can see or what we can hear or what we can feel or taste or touch or where we get our equilibrium. All four of those are involved in creating the one and only, the sole and single, the all and everything of anything that is something, whether it is infinite being, finite being, non-being, or conscious being. It is the all one as the alone. Plotinus speaks of the contemplative flight of the alone to the alone, small a to large a. Well, this alone is either, and perhaps both, all one and alone. All one and alone. It is all and it is one. It is omnos and it is aeon. As we recall from previous sessions, particularly last time where we were talking about the ontology of the aeon, and I referenced there the four co-founding parameters of reality. Some will call these ontological primitives. I'm saying that in order to have reality, you got to have four things. It's not reducible to one or the other. And yet, it can be if you utilize paradox and paralogic. we will talk more about that because that's part of the methodology of getting from non-being. Let's notice something here. First of all, in the plenum of being, you have both grounded nature, right? You have the things of which there just is no bounds to. There is no bounds to the will, the mind, the love, life. Life can go on forever. Will can go on forever. It has. There is no time at which will or love or mind or life or energy or self was not. It always has been, it always will be. When we're talking about myths, we're not talking about past causes and past things that happen with finite objects and gods and what have you. Those are all pictorial representations, dramatic illustrations of what's going on now. Now. When I'm talking to you about theogony, that is about how you get from the one to the many, and we did that last time with the tetractys, right? I think I got that here. Yeah. Here, take a look at the tetractys. We have the monad, which represents, here's the self, the aeon, the source, the singularity. That's what we're talking about now. We're talking about this source, this singularity is here now. It wasn't before 14 billion years ago, and it's not going to be after. We're talking about the monad, the one, the only, is here, it is now, it is the source of all. That is your third kind of causation. This is agnostic causation. It is unitive causation. It is what allows anything to manifest as part of everything. It either all happens together or it doesn't happen at all. And when it does happen together, it's conscious being that carves what isn't going to be happening from potential being, keeping it, as you will, in abeyance or as latency for a later time to become a patency, something that manifests. And what we are talking about is 10 being the perfect theogonic number for helping to pictorially explain how the monad becomes the dyad, becomes the triad, becomes the tetrad. And we looked at the examples of the dyad, and here I'm talking about that's the basic epistemic relationship of the self as the subject to the other in the world. It isn't as if when I'm existing as a dyad who sees the rest of the world in those terms, as if my monad, my experience of unity, went away. It's the very ground upon which that relation between me and the other exists. We are both underpinned by the same ground. I see it as an object. The object is seen by a subject. What the object is, as its own subject, is something we will discern in cognology in a future episode. And there we will talk about the triad, where we break apart that relation into actual experience of the knower, the knowing, and the known. The I, thou, and the it, the spirit, the soul, and the soma, these three realms, the three kind of causations. Right? We spoke of that with the tribhava, where you've got the tricosm, and below that you got the triloka, the three realms. You've got the tricosm of the macrocosm, the minicosms, and then me, the microcosm in between. And then you've got, of course, the triverse. There is this universe, which are all connected as a space, time, causality, entity continuum. That's the universe. Are there other universes like this? In what is called the multiverse, which is accessible by imagination and by elation, that is, by inferential knowledge, so that we see another world, a counterpart to us, that may differ in only one aspect. In that world, I don't happen to have a crystal sphere with its base sitting on this table. That's the only difference in that world. Now, does that world exist? Well, it doesn't exist for me. Now, does it? It doesn't exist for you. Now, does it? The world we're living in is connected through finite causation, the nexus of causality. In another world, that nexus of causality might have had me forgotten to bring this, or deliberately not use this as a prop during this particular session. One can say, who knows? That is, you can't scientifically, empirically go there because it's not your finite world. So that isn't going to happen. However, do they have an epistemic relation? Do you think there's subjects and objects in that world similar to ours? Your imagination wants to affirm it. Certain logics will allow you to affirm it. Depends what your logics are. I am talking about logic, the way we usually speak of it, as a tool that's used in the finite world, or if you will, in the mathematical world of transfinite realities, the numbers. However, when we're talking about the tetrad coming from the triad, we're speaking about that knower-knowing known relationship actually becoming the knower, the knowing, and the knowledge, and the known. The knowing, that is the process, and the knowledge, that is the state, become two different things. And I can stop and check a state of my conscious knowledge from before. I can say, what is it I said before? I can take that state through this process, which in terms of the triad, they were only involved in terms of knowing. We looked at it from that aspect. Remember, you can look at reality from any taxon you like, that is, from any category. What categories make sense, make the best sense, make the best meaningful explanation in terms of you as an empirical being, that is a being of finite experience, you as a epistic being, that is a being with transfinite experiences that you keep carrying along. The past is gone, the future hasn't come, but you got an imagination toward that, and you've got a memory toward that. All right. Let's return here for a moment to our four quadrants: Atma, Apeiron, Aletheia, which is the finite aspect of the Apeiron, and Abhava, which is part of Parousia. Now, this is a very paradoxical thing for many people. They want to know how it is that you understand being. Here you've got infinite being, here you've got finite being. Here you have absolute being, and here you have relative being. This is all caused. All this eternity that's uncaused. There never was a cause to eternity. There isn't a cause to infinity. There's not a cause to totality. There's not a cause to the unity. That's what is. That's what is, whether it's in this universe or in some other multi-universe that we consider a fictional world, or imaginary world, or whether it's part of the paraverse. That is the untapped, tappable being that is limitless. Doesn't matter how many multiverses how many infinite multiverses you want to exponentially increase. Paraverse to that, it is as if it were a speck of what its infinite potential is. This is what we're dealing with in the aeon. We want to know, how is it that something from a point of being one becomes all this multifarious diversity? I utilize the omniversal model, as you know, for description and explanation because I find it a very powerful theoretic model that helps us to construct our theories. It helps us to look at the various ideas and see them as integral, integrated aspects, having elements that we can discern. The reason that things are as complex and complicated as they are is because there's an infinite potential that is all funneled through one single point for every particular aeon. So if there's a macrocosm, there's a point at which that macrocosm is centered. If there's a microcosm, there's a point at which it's centered. If there's a minicosm, there's a point at which it's centered, and all its experiences feed into that center, and they flow from that center. Remember what Suzuki says, the one will, whole and complete, right? What is it doing? It's both the watcher and the actor. Those two things are happening at the same time. Now, in terms of my serial experience of linear reality here in the empirical world, I may say sequentially, well, I'm paying attention to this sentence, and then I'm paying attention to my next sentence, or this screenshot or that screenshot, or this page or that page, right? Or this recipe or that. What doesn't matter what you take. You divide it, look at it sequentially, and you say, well, this is the way time is divided. It's moving here from the past to the future. It's got an arrow. That's its dimension. That dimension is two-dimensional before and after, or three-dimensional, past, present, and future. It's going to be four-dimensional, like four dimensions of space, and four-dimensional entities. We'll consider that later on in ontology. But today we're considering protology. We're talking about the one, and how you get from the point of consciousness here in the omniversal model, or just call it the point, and how you have these radial vectors and an axis of identity, it doesn't matter where, and a faculty of experience, and as you know, I've put faculties at each four of these points, or the whole sphere of awareness, because I'm trying to look at this not just in terms of a two-dimensional image, but a three-dimensional image. We're trying to get the idea that there's a sphere, and then you have inside of that this octahedron, which represents, of course, the four powers that I constantly talk about, right? We have all different names for them, but quite simply, we're talking about will, and we're talking about mind, and we're talking about heart or feeling, and we're talking about life or action. They're all together all at once. When I'm speaking, it isn't as if I don't have some feeling going on, or that there isn't thinking going on, or that there isn't doing. Thinking is doing. It has energy, right? And it also has intentionality, right? It also has a certain tone, right? These are all happening at once. You can use different categories to refer to what's happening because it gives us an idea of how complex we really are, multifaceted. However, we are a symmetry. It's very important to understand, and that's why I use an octahedron. It's beautifully balanced. And it's something in which I can talk about going from the one through the two to the three to the four to the five to the infinite. Because You can have any kind of shapes that you want to within the sphere. And here we're just looking at it in terms of just one. We've presented the rest of the world. We've presented everything else. There's only this. There's only Om. There's only the omniversal model of the point. And how does the point get from there to the entire sphere of awareness? Well, it does so through those four ontological primitives. Quad being. The quad being here of infinite being, finite being, non-being, and of course, conscious being. We need all four of those to account for our vision of reality. We can also use different terminology that is going to help us to understand how a point which is dimensionless becomes all of this continuum. We see here we have impartite being and partite being. That's basically your infinite universals and your finite particulars, whether it's a finite particular page or a pointer or your body or the fingernail on your left hand in your body, whatever. That's part of cis reality. It's the side of reality that's manifested. It's here. That's why we can see it. The reality that undergirds it all, that is its infinite foundation, I've termed trans-reality. That's always there. If you will, it's like the sky all across you, and you, as an individual air-breathing organism, are going to constantly partake of that air and circulate that air, but you're not going to exhaust it by your one set of cyclic rhythmic breathing. Then we have, of course, de-reality, which is non-being, and we have irreality. Again, that's a term I'm taking from Husserl. Great term. Consciousness is irreal. That's why I can entertain contradictions in my mind that, of course, space will not allow for in terms of empirical causation. Imminently, I can hold the idea of contradictory beliefs, and we all do that, and part of eliminating our hypocrisy between what we believe up here and what we say and do out here is where we align our beliefs. So we see what really is the case rather than thinking that it's this way when we're in this state of mind with these people, and then we think a little differently when we're alone. Right? All this reprocessing that we do, this rethinking that we do, this renotation. We're always taking meanings, and we're always reapplying meanings in our present existential moment as conscious beings. Those are our transfinite experience. Now here, afinite. This is important. This is where it all turns. Afinite. What's the difference between, see, afinite has, as we said, it's de-reality. As I was talking about it, you know, if you're carving potentials as a conscious being from being to make finite being, you're excluding a lot of could. You know, when Michelangelo was looking and he saw David in the marble, right? He didn't see Mona Lisa or the Madonna or Figaro or Jesse James. He didn't see any of that. He saw David. That was the image. He carved everything else away. Everything else had non-being to him. That's what he had to conform David to. It had to be unique, and it couldn't be anything else. That's de-reality. But you see, de-reality is afinite. It doesn't have any dimensions. Well, what's the difference between the afinite and the infinite? Between the afinite and the infinite? If this has that's all absences, that has absolutely no dimensions. And I've said to you before that when you're speaking of the infinite, it is that which is not finite, right? What's the difference between what's not finite, the infinite, and a finite, which again, it's not finite. Well, it's not only, the a finite is not only not finite, it's not infinite. Infinity allows its potentiality to expand without limit. So you can have infinite numbers, right? Pi can be going on forever. It allows that expansion. Affinity does not allow for that expansion. It is not that expansion. It is not a finite concretization as part of that expansion. It is not the conscious being who limits that expansion to this particular item. Rather, if you were to take that entire picture of the omniversal model and say, here's a point here, right? And then there's our uppermost point, which we've been calling pneuma, or spirit. And then there's a nadir point, right? There's the zenith, there's the center, there's a nadir, there's a low point. And that we've been anchoring as the empirical self, and this as the epistic self, and this is the agnostic self, or spirit, soul, and soma, if you will. Well, if you've got 3 points there, then you take this sphere, and you take those 2 points, and then visualize that there's a point in the center. Now, with a turn of perspective, you're going to see nothing but a single point. You're going to see this. And if I kept the octahedron here, if I kept the octahedron inside of it, when I turn that, you're going to see nothing but a square. And here we have the 1. Here we have the 2. And here we have the 3. So with this device, this geometric device, as a philosophical ideational construction, we're referring to theogony. That is the production from one of the many to the many. And so from the one, we're talking about a collapse that takes place at an omniversal level, where what was here, the axis line that connected 3 points, I didn't show the other 2, but this point here and here, 3 of them, you take, and of course you turn that, and you're going to have, looking down, this axis right here, are all 3 points collapsed. My point is this. Those points appear to be 3 different points only in the dimensionality of space, the depth of space. Space, you understand. Remember we talked about the ontography of space and its 14 various subplanes and 7 major planes, and how that spanned from finity through transfinity to infinity. Oh, that different depth. That's space. That's all space. And on the cross of space and time, of course, time goes from the past, moves through the present, and goes to the future. So we have space and we have time. But on the Celtic cross, you know that there's a circle. That's energy. Space and time are unfurling energy. And right at the center, you tack space and time at the center of that time, from past to future. Space from the highest spirit to the lowest concretization of matter, and right in the center, that is where the entity appears. And the entity apparently appears from nowhere. And that's why it's part of parousia. Because Atma and Abhava are part and parcel, if you will, of the column of the ground and nature of being that actually does the carving up of the infinite into the finite. They're co-partners. It's Shiva, it's Shakti, it's the syzygy. The syzygy. The syzygy that we spoke of here. I think I put that there. Yes, I did. Syzygy and duality with the dyad. You see, it isn't as if you're either a monad or you're dyad or you're a triad or tetrad. You're all of it. And plus much more. But in terms of explaining how it is that you come from nowhere, you come from nowhere as a conscious being. And nowhere, the void, is not nowhere. It's not a lack of space. Space doesn't even apply to the afinite, as we talked about, Abhava. Time doesn't apply to it. Eternity doesn't apply. Nothing applies to it. It is all these these five absences, three of which I explained last time. About the antecedent asat, right? Before this came into being, it wasn't. So it has antecedent non-being. When it came into being and it exists, then its non-existence no longer applied as an ingredient to reality. When someday this is destroyed, it will have antecedent non-existence, or asat, or abhava, or non-being. And that will have no end. Once it's gone, it's gone. But it never had a beginning in terms of its antecedent non-being, did it? You can't point at some time and say, well, you know, the non-being of this pointer happened over there at, about, I think it was, was it 11.2 million or billion years ago, or I don't know. It never had a beginning in terms of its non-being. It does have a beginning in terms of its being. And the moment that this thing came into existence, its non-being collapsed. It's no longer part of its reality. But yet it had to be in order to be this thing, which it is now. And that's part of the mystery of time. It's an unfolding of the various energies by that point. But that point that's on the cross of space and time, which I am simply alluding to this time, and we will treat that more in ontology the next time. But the point here, which is on the cross of space in its various depths and dimensions, and time as it flows from the past through to the future, we are all, as I said, that point is pinned there. Yes, but we stretch out in that point. From the past, I grab as a transfinite being. I have a past. I remember my history in the particulars, the episodes. And I envision a future. I can easily imagine the future in which I continue. There's no problem with that. I'm outstretched on the cross of time. But as well, from the top of my spiritual and the less material components that compose my psyche all the way down through to the various components that cellularize my physique, all of that space is contained in me, and I'm pinned to it. And within all of it is the energies, part of which I contain, right? The chemical, electrical, synaptic connections that are firing as the neurons in my brain, and the flows of the various endocrine substances throughout my body and the lymphatic system and all the other physiological systems, they're all functioning together, but somehow they're all part of the one, and they all are one themselves in order to be part of that one. And that is the fundamental ground of reality, which we've referred to as conscious being and infinite being in terms of our quadrants. The ground of reality is always there. There's always the chance for infinite love, for more talk, for more ideas, for more intentionality. That's the basis of self-transformation. You are going to creatively alter elements of yourself on the cross of space and time as you are stretched out upon the crucifix of space and time, energy, and entityhood. You are the entity that is caught in space and time and energy and causation, along with all the other entities. And so, in terms of the sphere of awareness, it comes to be through the octahedron that we've discussed before. There's a singularity. All of it is contained. It's singular. It's symmetrical in that everything is balanced. Now, you can say you're losing your balance when you're walking, or you're regaining your balance when you're walking. Well, you're actually doing both. That's what balance is. It's moving from a state of disequilibrium to equilibrium and maintaining equilibrium in between. That's not a Raja. That's Shiva dancing, right? On the corpse of Mara, which is the delusive, finite world that wants to say, well, we're just all broken pieces of some unknown puzzle. But the esotericist and the awakened one understands that it's all interconnected and there's nothing that is not relative, but at the same time, there's nothing that's not absolute. We all participate in what is absolute. We are all engendered from the absolute. We all live at this moment in the absolute monad. There's none of us who do not. And the fact that it has no dimensionality whatsoever should cause us no concern, because in this dimensionalized world, this is a world which has been measured by mind. It's been measured by mind. It was pre-measured by macrocosmic mind, but it is measured by microcosmic minds throughout history as we get together. And one of the greatest templates that I have for understanding not only this finite world, but the transfinite and the infinite, is looking at it as a system. And if you look at the aeon as a system, it has a structure and a function, a pattern, and a process. Not only that, it has a basis, and this is what we're discussing in terms of protology as the aeon. There is a basis for both the process and the pattern, both the function and the structure, all four of them together as a functional system, as they manifest as every particular event. Every event is part of a process, and if you look at it, it's contained in a larger pattern, whether it's the events of my speaking or respiration or the circadian rhythms of each of our lives or the diurnal rhythms of the day, and the sun comes, right, and we have sunshine and then night follows. It doesn't matter. Or it's the rotation of the earth, it's the revolution around the sun, it's the solar system that's moving throughout the Milky Way, and the Milky Way that's moving around certain other parts relative in the universe. All of it forms a pattern, and all of it has a function. This has a function, right? My heartbeat has a function. The circulation of my blood throughout my system has a function. The air that's carried into my lungs has a function with the blood and with energizing my physiological apparatus, as all the as events. All of these are events, and there's a structure. In medicine, you look at anatomy, right? And that's the structure. And then physiology is the process. And what functions they form as well. Well, does the digestive function, is that the same thing as the neural functions? The function of the CNS, the central nervous system? Well, of course it isn't. These all have different finite functions. Best way to understand them is in terms of a systemic whole. And every systemic whole, all of this, has a basis. And that basis, as I said, if you turn it at the right angle, you'll see that that basis is actually the axis itself of identity that's extended from top through bottom and manifest in terms of the point that you occupy as the center of experience. I did attempt to convey some of that idea of integration of what we've been speaking about with the aeon as being tripartite. It's finite, transfinite, infinite, and afinite, right? Here's the afinite aspect. That's the point, the center, the source. It's afinite. But that is, remember, the very parousia, the ground of that, afinite, is consciousness, Atma. You'll see where we will go with this in terms of cognology. But now in terms of protology, in terms of monadology, in terms of discussing what it is, in terms of the one as the one and only, the singular, we're talking about the whole plenum as the circumference here, the sphere. That's the infinite. So this, of course, has no dimensionality whatsoever. It can appear anywhere. For convenience, I'm putting it here so that we can talk about the axis of transfinity, which is basically that consciousness. Here. The infinite, the transfinite, the finite. Let's put it in very simple terms. It's all going on at once. It's all happening here now. It's all right with you. It's all right with me. It's all of us all together. When I'm talking about the finite, it's your other consciousness. You've got consciousness of other things around you. It's that simple. When I'm talking about your soul, or your solar consciousness, or your psyche, or your psychical consciousness, I'm talking about self-consciousness. Finite is other consciousness, your consciousness of even in your thoughts. When you look at it, it's a finite thought. I manifest it as finite collection of syllables strung out phonemically in sentences. However, the inside, when you're looking at it, it's self-consciousness. You say, I'm hurt. I'm hurt by what they said. Or you say, I feel so good. It's nice to get that acknowledgement, okay? It's you inside. That's your self-consciousness. That's the soul. The other is your soma, where you're conscious of other things. And even when you're thinking about things and you're not self-conscious, right? You're down here at that somatic level as an empirical self. And we all do that. We lose ourselves in our profession. We lose ourselves when we're running and we're jogging. We lose ourselves on the treadmill. We lose ourselves when we're doing our accounting, our figuring numbers. We lose ourselves when we're writing a letter or we're typing an email. We're not consciously present at that moment, but we still are a soul. And at any moment I can say I'm conscious that I'm typing this to so-and-so. All right. So, other consciousness, that is consciousness of others, that's the empirical self. Consciousness of yourself and all its contents when you're aware of it and reflecting on it, that's your soul. Soma, soul. So what's spirit? Spirit is consciousness. Spirit is consciousness. It's infinite. Spirit is infinite self, infinite willing, infinite thinking or mind, infinite loving or feeling, and infinite life or doing. You can do, and you can do, and you can do. You can feel, and you can feel, and you can feel. No end to feeling. No end to doing. No end to willing. No end to thinking. What connects them all? Knowing. Knowing is intuition. You have 7. We all have 7 intuitional ideas of self. We covered the all as self. We've covered today the one as self. Next time, we're going to look at the self as the real. And we will talk more about these various aeonic modulations of measurability then. However, what I want to point out here is that in terms of manifestation, which is the same thing of Maya, it's all measurability. It's what can be measured. Now, I can measure, for instance, a feeling in this way. I can say, well, I love broccoli when it's cooked, but I hate broccoli when it's raw. That's not true, but I could say that. Well, we've got here a polarity. There's hate and there's love. I love broccoli when it's cooked. I hate broccoli when it's not. But at what point does the hate and the love balance out so you're neutral, and it doesn't matter how broccoli is cooked or whatever, you feel neutral about it. You see, that's that's measurable. But and it's scalable in the sense that you can say, in terms of a magnitude, I have more love of broccoli when it's cooked, and I have less love for it when it's not. It's scalable in that sense, but it is not measurable in the metric sense. It isn't as if you can put a meter up there and you can say, well, as they try to do, right, when you're in a medical clinic and they've got these smiley faces from 1 to 10, what they're trying to do is what I'm doing. They're trying to depict a state of consciousness in a conceptual diagram with these little icons and faces that are from sad to happy, from 1 to 10. And that's a kind of scale along which you can measure. But anybody who has done that has a very hard time discerning, well, what is the difference between a 5.5 and a 5.6? Or a 5.6 and a 6.1? We don't get that fine-grained and measurable where we can put a metric stick up to it and say, well, this is what it was. We do that with solid things. We do that with finite things. When we're talking about feelings, they're transfinite. When they occur as a finite experience, the feeling itself is finite as it's occurring in the present moment because you have a particular feeling. However, that feeling exists in a forest of the feelings you've had before that have all been sedimented into how this feeling is actually experienced. It wouldn't be this feeling with all that previous feelings. You wouldn't have this thought with all those previous thoughts. The thing that holds them all together is intuition. Intuition holds together feeling, thought, willing, and doing. That is knowing. Intuition is knowing. Thinking isn't knowing. You can have an opinion. That's your thought. That's your proposition. You don't know a thing. You've got to corroborate it through some kind of mechanism to see whether it's true or false. You have to corroborate what I'm saying as true or false within the mechanism you have experience. It's not the kind of mechanism of the empirical world. Remember, of cause and effect. I'm not going to take an idea and make it happen in your head as a kind of transitive causation. I'm going to use words that are going to affect a resonance within your brain, and then you're going to attach certain meanings to it on your own, and that's your immanent causality. That's going on inside you. You're generating that by yourself. That's your self-consciousness. So that self-consciousness can say, well, where did I just come from? What? You came from the previous set of neuronal connections that existed moments ago? No, because they exist right here now. They're going on right here now. How come you're conscious of being conscious? How come this happened? Well, this can only happen if there is absolute non-being, a voidness that is allowing you to experience something at all. That's the silence. That's why silence is always there. You can break the silence in terms of finite, right? There's silence now. Now I'm talking. There was silence then. Now I'm talking. That's all finite. Sound, silence. Sound, silence. When it gets to the relation of the epistic relation, there's always silence. There's always the silence of being that is connecting you as a self-consciousness that is perfectly capable of being aware of other things as well as yourself. It's always there. There's always that silence that is going to allow you to sound either in speech or in thought. And that silence is part of that unitive ground of being. That unitive ground of being, when we break it up and when we talk about these various modulations of measurability and how actually things function and have processes and patterns, that in the omniteric mode, we are going to be covering under the later chapters of Selfology 101, where we're going to deal with cognology, that is, the self as cognos, and then we're going to deal with the self as the pilgrim, and then we're going to deal with the self as the adept. And in those latter sections, you're going to see the unfurling of self, where being manifests through conscious being as an altogether new kind of being, what I call newtopia. It is where you are always utilizing your faculties consciously in order to creatively manifest and deliberately live the things that it is that you are experiencing with others in this interdependent reality of which there is being and conscious being and non-being. So, until the next time, which we will have session 4, and we're going to be dealing with the self as the real, reality. So we'll delve more into the 4 quadrants of reality at that time. So until then, behave when you must, be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself.